This is my true story. On my 75th birthday, I bought a small cake to share. I thought it would be a happy day. A day with candles, laughter, and maybe a hug or two. But the truth is, that night changed everything I believed about family. When I walked into my son's house, I was smiling. I had pressed my best shirt. My late wife used to say that shirt made me look sharp for an old man. The cake wobbled in my hands as I walked through the cold evening air. It wasn't fancy, just vanilla with white frosting. I had written my own name on top with shaky icing, "Happy birthday, Walter." I imagined my grandchildren running to me, maybe singing a small song. I imagined my son patting my back, saying, "Happy birthday, Dad." But when I opened the door, the sound that met me was not kindness. It was music. Loud, careless, thumping music. My son's friends were laughing, drinking, shouting. The smell of beer hung in the air like smoke. My son looked at me and frowned. "Dad, you didn't have to come. We're busy." His words hit me like cold wind. I smiled anyway. I said softly, "I just wanted to spend my birthday with family." Some people turned to look. I saw confusion on their faces. My son smirked, embarrassed that the old man had shown up. I walked to the table and placed the cake down gently. 7 candles. A small wish. Nothing more. He laughed. "You bought your own cake," he said loudly so everyone could hear. The room burst into laughter. I felt my heart tighten. But I smiled again. I said, "I didn't want to trouble anyone." He stepped closer. That cruel smile still on his face. "You shouldn't have," he said. Then, without warning, he lifted the cake with both hands and threw it to the floor. It hit hard. Frosting splashed across my shoes. Candles rolled under the chairs. One stayed burning on its side. The laughter that followed didn't sound human. It sounded like something hollow. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. My daughter-in-law looked away, pretending not to see. My grandchildren giggled. I stood still. My knees shook, but I didn't fall. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy who once called me hero. He was a man now, full of pride, but empty inside. He looked down at me and said, "If you want it so bad, old man, eat it from the floor." The laughter grew again. Sharp, cruel, endless. But I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just stared at that cake lying there, broken, useless, and shining under the kitchen light. I turned around and walked out. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called my name. Outside, the night was cold. The streetlights flickered. My hands trembled, not from age, but from disbelief. I had never felt smaller in my life. When I reached home, the silence inside my house felt heavy but safe. I sat at the table and looked at my shoes. Bits of frosting still clung to them. I brushed them off slowly, one by one. I thought of every sacrifice I had made. Every shift I worked late so my son could go to college. Every debt I paid, every roof I fixed, every time I said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. I whispered, "You will never humiliate me again." That night I didn't sleep. I sat there until dawn, staring at the one candle I had saved from the cake. Its wax had hardened, but the memory stayed soft and painful. People say humiliation fades. They're wrong. It settles inside you. It lives under your skin. The next morning, I could still hear the laughter. It followed me around like an echo. I poured myself coffee and tried to pretend nothing happened, but even the spoon shaking in my hand reminded me of his voice. Around noon, I went for a walk. The bakery where I had bought the cake was still open. The man behind the counter waved at me. "You came back quick, Mr. Hanley," he said kindly. "Was it good?" I tried to smile, but the words wouldn't come. I just nodded and walked away. On the way home, I passed a small park where I used to push my son on the swings. The metal chains were rusty now. The same wind that once carried his laughter now felt empty. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes. I could still hear my wife's voice in my head. "You give them too much, Walter. One day they'll forget who gave it." Back then, I thought she was wrong. I believed love could never turn cold. I was wrong. When I opened my eyes, I felt something different inside me. It wasn't anger. It was calm, deep and steady. I realized that silence was not weakness. It was waiting. That evening, I opened my old wooden drawer. Inside were papers, old deeds, account books, business shares. I had built everything with my own hands. Houses, savings, small businesses. I had written my son's name on most of them over the years, thinking it was love. Thinking it was security. But as I looked at those papers, I saw the truth. My name was still on every line. Every document still carried my signature. My control. He thought I was powerless. He thought old age meant defeat. But the power of a quiet man with a pen can be stronger than a room full of laughter. I closed the drawer and whispered to myself, "They don't know what I still hold." The next few days were quiet. My son didn't call. None of them did. The world went on like nothing had happened. To them, it was just another joke. To me, it was the night something inside me froze. I cleaned the kitchen, pressed my shirt, and watched the sun go down through the window. The chair beside me, where my wife once sat, looked too empty. I imagined her there, smiling softly, saying, "When pride grows louder than love, let silence answer it." I smiled for the first time since that night. Because I understood. Revenge didn't need rage. It needed patience. That silence, that stillness, wasn't loneliness anymore. It was preparation. I went through every old file I owned. Every document. Every note. Decades of effort, all neatly stored. My fingers traced my own name again and again, calm and sure. Everything they thought belonged to them was still mine. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me peaceful. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to curse. I just wanted to wait for the right moment. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror. I looked at the old man staring back. Lines on his face, yes, but eyes still clear. I said quietly, "Enough." For 75 years, I had lived for everyone else. Paid every bill. Solved every problem. Forgave every insult. But now, I would live for peace. When I walked outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Like the world had shifted just a little. My neighbors waved. I waved back. Nobody knew what had happened inside me, but something had. I spent the rest of the day sorting through memories. Old photos, letters from my wife, birthday cards from the years when my son still cared. Each one told a story of love slowly fading into convenience. That night, I made tea and sat by the window again. I remembered my wife's laughter, my son's small hand holding mine, the first time he called me Dad. Then I remembered the sound of that cake hitting the floor. The two memories didn't belong in the same world. But somehow, they did. I realized that sometimes, the people you love the most can teach you the hardest lessons. The lesson that kindness, when taken for weakness, turns into something stronger than anger. Days passed. I didn't see my son. I didn't expect to. But each morning, when I sat at my table, I felt more certain about what had to come next. Humiliation had turned into focus. Focus had turned into strength. They thought I had walked away defeated that night. But I had walked away awake. And when an old man wakes up after years of silence, the world should listen. As I looked out the window one evening, the sky turning orange, I whispered, "They will never laugh at me again." And in that quiet room, I finally smiled. Because I knew something my son didn't. I still held the keys that mattered. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the first small move. They had taken my dignity. But I still had everything else. And I was about to remind them. The next morning, I woke up early. The sky outside was gray and quiet, like the world was waiting for something. I sat at the same table where the broken candle had burned. My hands rested on the papers I had gathered the night before. Each page felt heavier than it looked. It wasn't paper anymore, it was power. I took a deep breath. I wasn't planning revenge out of hate. I was doing what I should have done long ago, take back what was mine. The first call I made was to the bank. The same bank I had trusted for 40 years. The manager, Mr. Evans, still recognized my voice. "Mr. Hanley," he said warmly. "How are you?" I smiled. "I'm fine, son. I just need to make a few small changes." He said, "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "Transfer all joint accounts to my private name. Effective today. Freeze all secondary holders." There was silence on the line. I could hear papers rustling. "Are you sure, Mr. Hanley?" "Yes," I said softly. "Completely sure." He didn't ask questions. He had known me long enough to understand that when I spoke like that, I meant it. By noon, every account that carried my name was mine again. Every dollar that once kept my son's house running now sat quietly where it belonged. After lunch, I opened the second drawer, the one with the house deeds. 9 properties in total. Some were in their names, some in mine, some hidden inside trusts they had never even read. My late wife and I had written those documents carefully, line by line. I had made sure to keep one small clause in each: final ownership would remain with me until my death. I was still alive. I picked up the phone again and called my lawyer. He had worked with me for years. "Activate the dormant clauses," I told him. "List all my properties for sale. Private buyers only." He paused. "All of them, sir." "All," I said quietly. "No exceptions." He didn't argue. He only said, "It will take a few hours." Hours. That's all it would take to erase decades of arrogance. While papers moved across desks and emails were sent, I made tea and looked out the window. The world outside seemed normal. Children played in the distance. Cars passed. Somewhere, my sons were probably laughing again, drinking, spending what they thought was theirs. They had no idea that everything around them was shifting. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through phone lines and pens. That night, I sat down and wrote a letter to myself. It said, "You don't owe anyone forgiveness. You owe yourself peace." I folded it carefully and placed it beside my wife's photo. She had always told me, if you give too much, people forget its value. I smiled. She was right. By the next morning, my lawyer called. It's done, Mr. Hanley. The deeds are moving. The accounts have been cleared. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat still for a long time, feeling nothing but calm. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was awake. Around 10 a.m., my phone started ringing. Unknown numbers. One after another. I ignored them. I knew who it was. My sons. They must have checked their accounts, seen the changes, and felt that same cold wind I'd felt when my cake hit the floor. The calls kept coming. I didn't answer. I poured myself coffee, opened the window, and listened to the world outside. For years, they had made noise. Now, silence belonged to me. By afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I didn't move. Then another, louder one. "Dad!" "It's me," one of them shouted. "We need to talk." I stayed still. The sound of panic in his voice was strange. It didn't sound like my son anymore. It sounded like a man losing ground. They kept knocking. I didn't open. Eventually, the voices faded, and the sound of their cars driving away filled the quiet. That night, I lit a small candle again. The same one from my birthday. Its light flickered, soft and warm. I whispered, "This time, I celebrate peace." The next morning, my lawyer called again. "The sales went through faster than expected," he said. "The new buyers have already transferred the funds." I nodded slowly. "Thank you." Then, almost as an afterthought, I said, "Send each of my sons a copy of their former ownership documents." Marked cancelled. There was silence. Then my lawyer said, "That will send a strong message." "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." Later that day, I received an email confirmation from the bank. Everything was finalized. The balances, the transfers, the revocations, all complete. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Years of burden lifted off my chest. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there, looking at the sky through my window. It was the same color as the frosting that once covered my shoes. The irony wasn't lost on me. By evening, I walked to the small park again. The benches were wet with dew. I sat down where I used to sit when my son was a child. I remembered pushing him on the swings. I remembered his laughter. His small voice calling, "Don't let go, Dad." I had held on for 75 years. But now, I finally let go. When I returned home, there were missed calls again. Messages. Pleading ones. "Dad, please call us. We can explain." Explain what? That I gave them everything and they threw it away. That love, when mocked, stops being love. I didn't reply. Instead, I made dinner, a simple bowl of soup, and sat at the same table. The house was quiet. Peaceful. I thought about what would happen tomorrow. How they'd wake up and realize everything had changed. Their houses, their businesses, their comfort, all gone in one silent night. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. They had built their comfort on my silence. Now, that silence had spoken. The next day, the news spread. People whispered. Banks talked. Lawyers called. Everyone wanted to understand how such a thing had happened overnight. The newspapers didn't know my name, but they called it the Hanley reversal. To me, it was simple. Respect lost, ownership returned. By afternoon, the knocks came again. This time louder. Desperate. My eldest son's voice broke through the wood. Dad! Please! You can't do this. I stayed seated, calm, silent. He shouted again. You've ruined us. I looked toward the door but didn't move. They had ruined themselves long ago. I had only turned on the light so they could see it. The shouting went on for a while, then stopped. Hours later, when night fell, I stepped outside. The air was cool. The sky was full of stars. I walked to the end of the garden and looked up. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel tired. I felt free. They had mocked my patience, my quietness, my kindness. But they forgot one thing: silence remembers everything. When I went back inside, I looked at my wife's photo again. I whispered, "It's done, my love. They finally know." The next morning, I made a cup of tea and turned on the small radio. The news mentioned property transfers and financial freezes. My sons' names were there, spoken like whispers. They must have been panicking. Calling banks. Calling lawyers. Trying to fix what they thought was broken. But it wasn't broken. It was simply returned to where it belonged. I sat by the window and thought about how quickly the world changes when arrogance meets truth. By noon, another knock came. Softer this time. I opened the door halfway. My youngest son stood there. His eyes were red. He looked smaller than I remembered. "Dad," he said quietly. "We didn't mean it that night. We were drunk. It was a stupid joke." I stared at him for a long time. "A joke," I repeated. "That's what you call it?" He nodded, looking down. "Please, just tell me what to do to fix this." I sighed. "You can't fix it, son. You can only learn from it." He started to cry. "We'll change, Dad. I promise." I stepped closer and put a hand on his shoulder. Promises mean nothing without respect. Then I closed the door slowly, gently, leaving him standing in silence. Inside, I sat back down at my desk. My heart was steady. No anger, no sadness. Just peace. I picked up my pen again. There was still more to do. A few more papers to sign, a few more loose ends to tie. As I wrote, I thought of how strange life is. How a man can spend decades giving and still be treated like nothing. But one moment of clarity can change everything. The laughter that night had burned into my memory. But now, a different sound filled the room, the soft scratch of my pen. The sound of justice being written quietly. I didn't destroy my sons. I gave them something better than wealth. I gave them a lesson they would never forget. That night, as I blew out the candle, I whispered, "Tomorrow, they'll understand." And I knew, deep down, that tomorrow would be the day the world turned upside down. Because the man they told to eat cake from the floor had just taken back the table they stood on. The next morning, the sun rose quietly. It looked like any other day, but I knew it wasn't. Today, the world had changed, not for everyone, but for my sons. I sat by the window with my tea. The steam rose in the sunlight, curling softly like a slow exhale of peace. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I simply waited. I knew what would happen. Somewhere across town, alarms were going off, not the kind that wake you from sleep, but the kind that shake you awake from arrogance. My eldest son would be the first to notice. He always woke early, proud of his discipline. I could imagine him sitting at his desk, opening his laptop, ready to check his business accounts. He would frown. Refresh the page. Frown again. His hand would tighten around his coffee cup as he saw the red words, access denied. Account restricted. He would call the bank, his voice sharp, impatient. There must be a mistake, he'd say. This is my account. And the calm voice on the other end would reply, I'm sorry, sir. The account has reverted to the primary holder. There would be a pause. A long, heavy silence. Then disbelief. Then panic. Across town, my second son would wake up to the same message. Then the third. Then the fourth. By breakfast, their phones would be lighting up with calls, each one asking the same question, what's happening? By 10 o'clock, they would realize what I already knew, everything they had built their comfort on was gone. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat there and listened to the sound of birds outside my window. Peace has a sound too, you know. It's quiet. It's steady. It feels like justice finally taking a deep breath. By noon, they came. I heard their cars before I saw them. The same loud engines they loved to show off were now shaking with urgency. Tires screeched in front of my gate. Doors slammed. Voices rose. Dad, one of them shouted. Dad, open the door. I stayed seated. They pounded on the door again and again, shouting my name like it was the first time they'd remembered it. I looked at the clock. The second hand ticked, calm and slow. I had no reason to rush. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. I heard them arguing outside. One voice said, he can't do this. He can't take it all. Another replied, he already did. Then quiet. Then footsteps fading away. When the last car engine died down, I finally stood up and walked to the window. The street was empty. Leaves were falling across the road. The world looked untouched, but I knew chaos was moving somewhere beyond it. I went back to my chair and wrote a note in my journal. It said, the loudest lesson is silence. By evening, the phone started ringing again. Dozens of times. I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear their voices. I knew exactly what they would say. The next morning, a new kind of silence filled the air, the silence that comes after pride breaks. At noon, there was another knock at the door. Softer this time. Almost polite. I opened it slightly. It was my eldest son. His face was pale. His eyes had dark circles under them. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Dad, he said quietly. We need to talk. I looked at him for a moment. Now you want to talk. He swallowed hard. We didn't mean to hurt you. We were drunk. It was stupid. We were just joking. I shook my head slowly. You weren't joking, son. You were revealing who you truly are. He tried to smile, but it fell apart. You can't take everything, Dad. It's too much. I looked him straight in the eyes. Too much. You threw my dignity on the floor and laughed. You called me stupid in front of strangers. Tell me, son, was that too much? He looked away. His lips trembled, but no words came out. I stepped aside and gestured to the garden. Do you see that tree? I asked. He turned slowly. Yes. I planted that tree when you were born. I watered it every week. It grew strong, but its roots never forgot where they came from. You, my son, forgot. He stared at the ground. I could see shame fighting with pride inside him. Pride was still winning. I said softly, when you threw that cake, you didn't just humiliate me. You humiliated yourself. And now the world knows it. He looked up, anger flashing. So this is revenge? You think this makes you better than us? I took a deep breath. No. It makes me free. He didn't answer. He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him go. The engine started, but he sat there for a long moment before driving away. After he left, I made tea and sat back down. The silence returned, and it felt like an old friend. That night, I received a call from my lawyer. Mr. Hanley, all transactions are finalized. Every asset is back in your name. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Thank you. He paused. You're a brave man, sir. No, I said quietly. Just an old man who finally learned his worth. When I hung up, I looked at my wife's picture again. I could almost hear her voice. When pride grows too loud, silence must speak. The next day, the newspapers were full of whispers. 9 men, stripped of wealth overnight. Businesses frozen. Properties transferred. Nobody understood how it happened. Nobody except me. They called it the Hanley shift. Reporters speculated, neighbors gossiped, lawyers scrambled. But I stayed quiet. In silence, truth often grows. By afternoon, I received another visitor. This time, it was my daughter-in-law, the same woman who had turned away when the cake hit the floor. She stood at my door, holding a small box of pastries. Dad, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to say sorry. We went too far. I looked at the box in her hands. The irony almost made me smile. You brought cake? Tears filled her eyes. Not for laughter this time. For apology. I nodded slowly. Apologies are like candles, dear. They mean something only if they're lit before the darkness. She didn't reply. She just stood there, eyes red, hands shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered again. I know, I said gently. But sorry doesn't rebuild respect. It only acknowledges it was destroyed. She placed the box on the step and left. I didn't open it. I let it sit there until the sun went down, then quietly placed it in the trash. Some things are better left untouched. That evening, I went through my letters again. I wrote a new one, not to them, but to myself. It said, when you give your whole life for others, make sure they remember your name. Days turned into a week. The calls slowed. The messages stopped. The silence deepened. I could finally breathe again. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up feeling needed. I woke up feeling alive. Every morning, I took a walk through the park. I watched children play, couples argue, dogs chase pigeons. Life was ordinary again, and that was beautiful. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Pride doesn't die quickly. It fights. It clings. And soon, it would come knocking again. 1 week later, it did. All 9 of them showed up this time. Cars lined the street in front of my small house. The same sons who had once laughed now stood together, heads bowed. I opened the door and looked at them. Their faces were pale, their clothes wrinkled, their confidence gone. The eldest stepped forward. Father, he said quietly. We've lost everything. Please, just talk to us. I said nothing. Another one spoke. Dad, we didn't know what we were doing. We were stupid. We were drunk. We're sorry. I looked at them all. You laughed while I stood covered in cake. You told me to eat from the floor. You turned my birthday into a show. You think a few words erase that? They shifted uncomfortably. Some of them started crying. Others looked away. I sighed. You lost your wealth, yes. But you haven't lost everything. You still have the chance to change. To rebuild. To become men your children can respect one day. They nodded, desperate, clinging to any hope I offered. But, I continued softly, I will not help you do it. Their faces froze. The youngest spoke, his voice breaking. Please, Dad, don't shut us out. I shook my head. I didn't shut you out. You locked the door the night you threw that cake. The eldest dropped to his knees. We'll do anything, Dad. Anything. I looked down at him. Then start by standing on your own. Silence fell again. Heavy, thick, and final. I stepped back and said, go home, sons. Learn what hunger feels like. Learn what humility tastes like. Then maybe, one day, we'll talk again. I closed the door slowly. Their voices faded behind it. Inside, I leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady. Calm. Peaceful. Outside, I could hear their cars starting, one by one. The sound drifted away into the night until only silence remained. I sat in my chair by the window and looked at the stars. The same stars that had watched me that terrible night now shone brighter, as if they knew justice had found its place. In that moment, I realized something powerful. Forgiveness doesn't always mean letting people back in. Sometimes it means letting yourself move on. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. Just a few clothes, my old watch, and my wife's photograph. I left the rest behind, the furniture, the papers, the echoes. When I stepped outside, the air felt new. The sun was rising, soft and gold. I locked the door behind me, placed the key under the mat, and whispered, goodbye. A taxi waited by the gate. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, smiled and said, where to, sir? Somewhere quiet, I replied. He nodded and started the engine. As the car rolled forward, I looked back at the house one last time. It looked smaller now. Softer. Like a memory fading. I didn't feel sad. I felt free. The city passed by outside my window. The same streets, the same bakery where I once bought that cake, now looked different. Lighter somehow. That bakery had been the start of my humiliation. But now, it was just another building on another road. The past was behind me, exactly where it belonged. As the car turned toward the highway, I whispered, they'll understand one day. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. You said something, sir? I smiled faintly. Just talking to an old memory. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing the world in light. For 75 years, I had carried the weight of love that was never returned. Now, at last, I was walking into peace. They thought I was broken. But I was only rebuilding. And somewhere out there, they were finally learning what I had known all along, that silence, once disrespected, becomes the loudest voice of all. The road stretched ahead, long and empty. The driver hummed softly to a tune on the radio. The world outside the car window rolled by in shades of gold and green. I sat quietly, watching it move, feeling lighter with every passing mile. For the first time in years, I had no destination in mind. No one to answer to. No one expecting anything. It was freedom, soft, steady, almost unreal. "Beautiful morning," the driver said. "Yes," I replied. "A beautiful one indeed." He smiled and focused on the road. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I could still see the candlelight from that broken cake. It flickered for years in my memory. But today, it was fading. The fire had burned long enough. After a few hours, the car slowed down near a quiet coastal town. Waves crashed softly somewhere in the distance. The driver looked back and said, "This is the last stop before the sea, sir." "That's far enough," I said. He helped me with my suitcase. I paid him, and he tipped his cap politely before driving off. His car disappeared down the road, leaving only the sound of gulls and wind. I stood there for a moment, breathing the sea air. It smelled of salt and peace, two things I hadn't tasted in years. A small inn stood nearby, its sign creaking gently. Seabreeze Cottage. I walked inside. A kind woman at the counter smiled. "Good afternoon, sir. Looking for a room?" "Yes," I said softly. "Something quiet?" She nodded. "We have one facing the ocean. You'll hear the waves at night." "That sounds perfect." The room was simple, a bed, a chair, a small window that opened to the endless blue of the sea. I placed my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed. The sound of waves filled the silence. For a long time, I just listened. It's strange how peace can feel unfamiliar when you've lived with noise for so long. I spent the next few days walking along the shore. Every morning, I watched the sun rise over the water. Every evening, I watched it sink back down, painting the sky in orange and pink. I didn't think much about my sons during those first days. The anger had gone. Even the sadness had softened. What remained was something quieter, understanding. They were not born cruel. I had raised them with love. But the world had changed them, and I had allowed it. I had spoiled them with comfort, mistaking dependence for closeness. I had given too much, thinking it would make them love me more. But love built on obligation eventually collapses. One evening, I sat on a wooden bench near the beach. A young couple walked past, holding hands, laughing. Their happiness was light, effortless. I smiled. I hoped they would never forget what love truly meant, respect. As the waves rolled in, I thought about my wife. I could still hear her voice, calm and wise. "If they forget what you gave them, one day you must remind them." I had reminded them. Not with shouting. Not with anger. With silence. The days passed softly. I rented a small cabin near the cliffs, overlooking the sea. I spent my mornings feeding birds and my afternoons reading old books I'd brought with me. Some nights, I wrote in my notebook. One page simply said, "Peace costs less than pride." Sometimes, I thought about the life I had left behind, the big house, the noise, the parties, the money that had meant everything to them. But those things had never truly belonged to me. The only thing that had ever been mine was the love I gave. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch when a postman arrived on a small motorcycle. "Mr. Hanley?" he asked. "Yes." "You've got mail, sir." "Came from the city." He handed me a bundle of envelopes. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. I didn't need to open them to know who they were from. My sons. I placed the letters on the table and looked at them for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw them away. Another part wanted to read every word. That night, after dinner, I lit a small lamp and opened the first one. It was from my eldest. "Dad, we were wrong. I was wrong. I can't sleep thinking about that night. I see your face every time I close my eyes. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try. I put the letter down and sighed. I opened another. Father, I lost my house, my job, my pride. But losing you hurts the most. Please write back. Please tell us where you are. Another letter, another apology. All the same words, all written with regret. I read every one of them. Some made me cry. Some made me shake my head. But mostly, they made me realize something important: pain teaches faster than comfort. The next morning, I wrote one letter in return. My sons, I've received your words. I've read your regrets. But understanding does not come from paper. It comes from living through what you've caused. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not ready to come back either. Use this time to remember the man you laughed at, and what he taught you. When you have truly learned, you will not need to find me. You will already know what to do. Your father. I sealed the letter and mailed it that afternoon. The postman nodded and said, "They'll get it in 2 days." Good, I said. That's enough time for reflection. As I walked back from the post office, the sea wind brushed against my face. I realized I was smiling again. Not out of pride, out of peace. The next few weeks passed gently. The world felt smaller but kinder. I made friends in town, the baker who always gave me extra bread, the fisherman who shared his morning catch, the old woman who sat by the lighthouse knitting scarves. They didn't know my story. They didn't need to. I was just an old man who liked the sea. That was enough. Sometimes, I would tell them small things about life. Don't let kindness become your cage, I'd say. Or, forgive, but don't forget who you are. They would nod politely, maybe not fully understanding. But I hoped one day they would. Every evening, I would sit on my porch and watch the horizon. The ocean never stays still. It moves, changes, breathes. So does life. One morning, months later, a letter arrived again. This time, the handwriting was neater. The words steadier. Dad, we found work. Real work. We're trying to rebuild. We're not asking for your money. We're just asking for your blessing. I smiled. That was the letter I had been waiting for. I didn't reply with paper this time. I just whispered into the wind, "You have it." And for the first time since that birthday, I felt light again. Years passed quietly after that. Seasons changed. My hair turned whiter, my hands slower. But my heart was calm. I had finally made peace with the past. Every now and then, I still thought of that night. The cake on the floor. The laughter. The silence that followed. But it no longer hurt. It was just a story now, one that had already ended. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sea turned golden, I sat in my chair and closed my eyes. I could hear the waves rolling in, the distant laughter of children somewhere down the beach. I thought of my wife. I could almost feel her hand on my shoulder. I imagined her saying, "You did well, Walter. You remembered who you are." A soft breeze came through the window. I took a deep breath, and the air felt like forgiveness. Maybe someday, my sons would find this place. Maybe they'd walk the same beach, feel the same wind, and understand the quiet power of regret and redemption. If they did, I hoped they'd sit on the same bench, look out at the sea, and whisper, "We're sorry, Dad. Thank you." But whether they did or not didn't matter anymore. I had already forgiven them, not with words, but with peace. I had learned that forgiveness is not something you give to others. It's something you give to yourself to stop carrying their mistakes. That night, I wrote one last entry in my notebook. They laughed when I stood in silence. But silence outlived their laughter. I closed the book, blew out the lamp, and watched the stars appear one by one. The sea whispered softly outside, the same rhythm it always had. The next morning, I walked down to the water's edge. The sand was cool under my feet. I watched the waves wash over my shoes and pull back, again and again. For 75 years, I had carried noise. Now I carried only peace. A boy ran past me chasing a kite. His laughter echoed across the beach, pure and free. I smiled. Maybe that was how I sounded once, long ago. I sat on a rock and whispered to the ocean, "It's time. Time to stop remembering pain. Time to start living in peace." I spent the rest of that day by the water, watching clouds drift lazily above the sea. As the sun began to set, the sky turned orange, then deep red, then finally purple. I knew that somewhere in the city, my sons were living quieter lives now. Working. Earning. Learning humility one day at a time. Maybe they still thought of me. Maybe they still wished they could undo what they had done. But they didn't need to. The lesson was already learned. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to understand what truly matters. As the final light faded, I stood up and looked at the horizon. The sea seemed endless. I whispered softly, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life. For teaching me the hard way. I turned and walked back toward my cabin, the path glowing softly under the moonlight. Inside, the room was quiet and warm. My wife's photograph sat on the shelf, her smile frozen in time. I touched the frame gently. "We did it," I said. And in that small cabin by the sea, surrounded by nothing but the sound of waves and the whisper of wind, I finally understood what happiness meant. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't applause. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was the ability to sit in silence and feel at peace with your own story. As I lay in bed, I smiled one last time. I wasn't the man who had been humiliated anymore. I was the man who had turned humiliation into wisdom. And before I closed my eyes, I whispered the final truth I had learned: they made my birthday a joke. I made their legacy a lesson. And that was the story of Walter Hanley, a father who turned silence into power and pain into peace. If this story touched your heart, don't leave quietly. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes, sharing a story reminds us, respect and love should never come too late.